all the emotions I went through in my career. I went through the little kid next door, everyone loves, da-da-da, to the villain, and then thrust with the bend and all that stuff, to the world record, and now the old guy that knowing that it's over. And now the guy's saying, wait a minute, he can do this. We're behind him. I mean, so I went through all of it in my 12 years of Olympic experience. I've been asked countless times who the greatest athlete of all time is. That's usually the easy conversation. People can point to medals. They can point to records. They can compare numbers across different eras and different sports. Everyone has a list. Everyone has an argument. But admiration is something else. The athletes you admire stay with you for reasons that statistics can't fully explain. Sometimes it's what they achieved. Sometimes it's how they achieved it. And sometimes it's because they showed you something about greatness that you didn't understand until years later. When I look back on my own career, I don't just remember the races I won. I remember the people who changed the way I thought about competition. The people who raised the standard for everyone around them. The people who carried pressure that most athletes could never imagine and somehow performed anyway. Some of them competed on the track, some didn't. Some came before me, some came after me. What connects them isn't that they were all the same kind of athlete. It's that each one represented a different kind of excellence. One taught me what courage looks like when the entire world is watching. One showed me the power of discipline. One spent his career proving that limits are often imaginary. One changed the way people viewed dominance. And one accomplished things so extraordinary that even athletes from completely different sports had to stop and admire what they were seeing. These are the 5 athletes I admired most. And the story starts with a man whose influence was already shaping my life long before I ever stepped onto an Olympic track. Long before I won an Olympic gold medal, I already knew who Jesse Owens was. If you grew up in track and field in America, you don't really have a choice. His story finds you early. At first, I knew the headlines. 4 gold medals in Berlin in 1936. One of the most famous performances in Olympic history. The image of Owens running, jumping, and winning in front of a world that wasn't expecting him to become the face of those games. But the older I got, the more I realized that the medals weren't the most impressive part. It was everything surrounding them. When people talk about pressure today, they're usually talking about expectations from coaches, fans, sponsors, or the media. Owens was dealing with something much larger than that. Every race carried political weight. Every victory meant more than a result sheet could ever show. That's difficult for most athletes to fully understand. When I walked into Olympic stadiums during my career, I felt pressure. Of course I did. The expectations around me were enormous. People expected me to win every time I stepped onto the track or runway. They expected perfection. But nobody expected me to carry what Jesse Owens carried. That's why admiration is different from simple respect. Respect comes from achievement. Admiration comes from understanding what someone had to endure to achieve it. What always impressed me about Owens was how calm he appeared. You look at the photographs, you watch the old footage, you don't see panic, you don't see fear. You see a man competing as though he belonged there, even when much of the world wanted to tell him otherwise. That kind of confidence changes people. It certainly changed me. Every generation of athletes has someone who expands the definition of what's possible. For many American track athletes, Jesse Owens was that person. He showed us that excellence could become a statement. That performance could become history. His influence was still present decades later when athletes like me arrived. You could feel it. Not because people talked about him every day, because the doors he helped open were already there. One thing I've always found interesting is that Owens didn't have the advantages that later generations enjoyed. Modern training methods didn't exist. Sports science was limited. International competition looked completely different. Yet somehow his achievements still survive every comparison. That tells you something. Greatness usually belongs to an era. Influence survives every era. And Owens had both. The more years that pass, the more I appreciate that distinction. Records fall, times get faster, techniques improve, new stars emerge, but very few athletes leave a mark that remains visible nearly a century later. Jesse Owens did. When people ask why I admire him, the answer has very little to do with statistics. I admire him because he proved that an athlete can become larger than a sport. And once you understand that, you understand why his name is still being spoken long after the race is ended. You don't forget athletes like that. But he wasn't the only one who changed the way I looked at excellence. In fact, the next man on this list was someone I actually watched up close. And what impressed me most wasn't his speed. It was his discipline. The next athlete on my list is Edwin Moses. Now, this one is different. Jesse Owens was someone I learned from through history. Edwin Moses was someone I watched in real time. I saw the standard he set. I saw the effect he had on other athletes. And I saw how difficult it was for anyone to come close to matching what he was doing. When most people think about great athletes, they think about spectacular moments. They think about Olympic finals, world records, dramatic finishes, and unforgettable celebrations. Moses certainly had those moments. But that isn't why I admired him. What impressed me was everything that happened before the starting gun. I've always believed that talent can get you noticed. Discipline is what keeps you there. And nobody embodied that better than Edwin Moses. When he competed in the 400 meter hurdles, it often looked unfair. Not because he was physically overwhelming in the way some athletes are, not because he intimidated people with emotion or theatrics. It was because he seemed to understand his event at a level nobody else did. Most athletes race against opponents. Moses often looked like he was racing against a mathematical equation. Every stride had a purpose. Every hurdle was approached with precision. Every race appeared to follow a plan that had been rehearsed hundreds of times before anyone entered the stadium. As athletes, we all search for consistency. Moses found it, and then somehow held on to it for years. Think about how difficult that really is. One bad start can ruin a race. One injury can change a season. One mistake can end a winning streak. Yet Edwin Moses went nearly a decade without losing a 400 meter hurdles race. Nearly 10 years. More than 100 consecutive victories. Even today, that sounds almost impossible. For athletes, numbers like that don't just represent dominance. They represent concentration. They represent discipline. They represent an ability to avoid complacency year after year after year. That's much harder than most people realize. Winning once creates hunger. Winning repeatedly creates comfort. Comfort is dangerous. Many champions lose because they stop searching for improvement. Moses never seemed to stop. What fascinated me was how scientific his approach became. He studied races. He analyzed stride patterns. He looked for advantages that other athletes ignored. Long before data-driven training became common, he was already thinking that way. That mindset separated him from the field. I remember watching him and realizing that athletic greatness wasn't always about doing something spectacular. Sometimes it was about eliminating weaknesses so completely that opponents couldn't find a way in. That's a different kind of power. And it affected athletes outside his event. Certainly me. When you're surrounded by champions, you pay attention to how they operate. You watch their habits. You observe how they prepare. You look for clues. Moses taught an entire generation that preparation could become a competitive weapon. That's a lesson that stays with you. Even today, when people discuss his streak, they often focus on the number itself, the victories, the championships, the records. I understand that. But when I think about Edwin Moses, I think about something else. I think about the discipline required to wake up every day knowing everyone wanted to beat you and still refusing to lower your standards. That isn't talent. That's character. And character is much harder to build than speed. That's why I've always admired him. Not because he won so often, because he never allowed success to change the way he worked. Very few athletes can say that. And then came someone who challenged the idea of what a human body could actually do. Someone who spent years turning world records into stepping stones instead of destinations. The third athlete on my list is Sergey Bubka. This one might surprise some people. After all, I was a sprinter and a long jumper. Bubka was a pole vaulter. We competed in entirely different events. We trained differently. We measured success differently. But admiration doesn't require similarity. Sometimes it comes from watching someone attack a challenge that most people can't even comprehend. The first thing that stood out about Bubka was the way he treated limits. Most athletes spend their careers chasing a record. Bubka seemed to spend his career moving the record again and again, year after year. Every time people thought he had reached the ceiling, he found another few centimeters, then another, then another. From the outside, that might not sound dramatic. To athletes, it was astonishing because we all know how difficult improvement becomes at the highest level. Early in your career, progress comes quickly. You get stronger, faster, more experienced. Eventually, every game becomes expensive. 1/100th of a second, a fraction of an inch, a tiny technical adjustment. That's where greatness usually lives. Bubka made those tiny improvements look routine. What many people don't appreciate is how unforgiving pole vault really is. In sprinting, you can occasionally survive a small mistake. In long jump, you might recover from an imperfect attempt. Pole vault doesn't offer much forgiveness. Your speed has to be right. Your timing has to be right. Your takeoff has to be right. Your confidence has to be right. If one piece fails, everything can fail. That's what made watching Bubka so fascinating. He wasn't simply competing against other athletes. He was competing against complexity. Every jump required complete commitment. Once you're moving down that runway, hesitation becomes your enemy. There is no halfway point. You trust the pole. You trust your training. You trust yourself. Then you launch into the air. That level of commitment demands something special mentally. I always admired athletes who could perform while carrying enormous expectations. Bubka lived with those expectations for years. Every competition brought the same question. Would he break the record again? Imagine hearing that every time you compete. Not. Can he win? Can he do something nobody has ever done before? That's a completely different burden. And somehow he embraced it. What impressed me even more was that he seemed genuinely motivated by the challenge itself. Many athletes reach a goal and relax. Bubka reached a goal and immediately started looking for another one. That's rare, very rare. As athletes, we spend so much time pursuing a finish line. The finish line becomes the dream. For Bubka, the finish line often looked like the starting point for the next challenge. That mentality resonated with me because I understood it. In my own career, people sometimes assumed that winning would remove the pressure. It doesn't. Success creates new expectations. The better you become, the harder it is to surprise people. Yet, Bubka kept finding ways to do it. I remember watching him and thinking that his greatest strength wasn't physical. Of course, he was gifted. Every champion is. But the deeper strength was psychological. He never seemed satisfied with yesterday's achievement. That's what separates extraordinary athletes from great ones. Great athletes reach the summit. Extraordinary athletes keep climbing after they've already arrived. When I think about Sergey Bubka today, I don't immediately think about a specific height or a specific record. I think about possibility. I think about a man who spent years convincing the world that the limit wasn't where people thought it was. And every athlete needs someone like that. Someone who expands the horizon, someone who makes impossible look temporary. That's why I've always admired him. But then came an athlete who didn't just dominate his event. He changed the way the entire sport looked. And for a while, it felt like every race he entered belonged to him before the gun even fired. The fourth athlete on my list is Michael Johnson. Now we're talking about someone I understood from a very different perspective. Michael Johnson wasn't a figure from history like Jesse Owens. He wasn't competing in a completely different event like Edwin Moses or Sergey Bubka. He was part of my world. Track and field, the same stadiums, the same spotlight, the same expectations. And because of that, I probably appreciated his greatness more than most people. One of the things I learned during my career is that elite athletes often look similar from a distance. Everyone trains hard. Everyone sacrifices. Everyone wants to win. What separates the truly special ones is the ability to be different without being distracted by that difference. Johnson was different. You noticed it immediately. His running style didn't resemble anyone else's. Coaches spent years teaching athletes to run a certain way. Michael Johnson seemed to ignore the rule book entirely. The upright posture, the high knee action, the unique stride pattern. For years, people questioned whether it could work. Then he kept winning and winning and winning. That's one of the reasons I admired him. Most athletes spend their careers trying to fit into a model that's already been proven successful. Johnson built his own model. Then he proved everyone else wrong. That takes confidence, not the loud kind, not arrogance, real confidence, the kind that allows you to trust your instincts when the rest of the world is questioning them. I understood that feeling. Throughout my own career, there were moments when people thought they knew exactly what an athlete should look like, how an athlete should compete, what an athlete should say. The pressure to conform can be surprisingly powerful. Johnson never seemed interested in conforming. He believed in what worked for him, and the results spoke for themselves. The moment that always comes back to me is the 1,996 Olympics in Atlanta. Track and field has produced countless unforgettable races. That 200 meter final belongs near the top of the list. I remember watching it like everyone else. The anticipation was enormous. Johnson was already a star. Expectations were sky high. Millions of people were waiting to see whether he could deliver. That's when many athletes become cautious. That's when pressure starts affecting decision-making. That's when greatness sometimes shrinks. Johnson did the opposite. When the race started, he looked completely free. There was no hesitation, no tension, no visible fear, just acceleration. As the curve unfolded, something unusual happened. The race stopped looking competitive. World-class sprinters were suddenly chasing a man who seemed to be operating under different rules. By the time he crossed the finish line in 19.32 seconds, people weren't just reacting to a gold medal. They were reacting to a performance that redefined what seemed possible. Every athlete watching understood the significance. We knew records, we knew history, and we knew we had just seen something extraordinary. What impressed me most wasn't the time itself. It was the way he handled the moment. Because Olympic pressure can do strange things to athletes. The bigger the stage becomes, the more difficult it is to perform naturally. Johnson somehow looked more comfortable as the pressure increased. That's a rare gift. You can't teach that. You can't manufacture it. You either possess that ability or you don't. When people discuss Michael Johnson today, they often focus on records and championships. Those achievements deserve every bit of attention they receive. But what I admire most is something less measurable. He had the courage to be himself. He trusted his own path. And then he performed at the highest level imaginable while millions of people watched. That's harder than people think. Much harder. And for that reason, Michael Johnson earned my admiration long before the medals were counted. But even Johnson wasn't the athlete who ultimately sits at the top of this list, because the final name forced athletes from every sport to rethink what Olympic dominance could actually look like. The final athlete on my list is Michael Phelps. I'll admit something right away. Comparing athletes across different sports is never easy. A sprinter doesn't compete against a swimmer. A swimmer doesn't compete against a pole vaulter. The demands are different. The training is different. Even the way success is measured can be different. That's why I've always been careful about making broad comparisons. But every once in a while, an athlete comes along who forces everyone to pay attention no matter what sport they come from. Michael Phelps was one of those athletes. The first thing that struck me wasn't the medal count. People see 28 Olympic medals and immediately stop there. The number is so large that it almost becomes difficult to understand. But athletes know something the public often doesn't. Medals are the result. The real story is what it takes to keep putting yourself in position to win them. That's where my admiration for Phelps begins. Winning an Olympic gold medal is difficult. Defending one is harder. Remaining dominant across multiple Olympic cycles is one of the hardest things an athlete can ever attempt. Most champions experience a rise and a fall. That's the natural rhythm of sports. You climb, you reach the top, then eventually someone younger, faster, or hungrier arrives. Phelps somehow kept delaying that process. For years, when I watched him compete, I wasn't just watching races. I was watching consistency on a scale that almost didn't make sense. The Olympic Games come every 4 years. Think about that. 4 years of preparation can disappear in a matter of seconds. One mistake, one bad turn, one poor finish, one illness at the wrong time. Everything can be gone. Every Olympic athlete understands that fear. Phelps kept showing up anyway, and he kept winning. The moment that stands out most for me is Beijing in 2008. At that point, expectations had become almost unreasonable. People weren't asking whether he would win. They were asking how many times he would win. That's an extraordinary burden to carry. When expectations become that high, athletes can start competing defensively. They become afraid of making mistakes. Phelps never looked that way. Race after race, he seemed willing to embrace the pressure rather than avoid it. The 8 gold medals were remarkable. But what impressed me even more was the emotional discipline required to stay focused through that entire Olympic program. Swimming isn't like sprinting. A sprinter might have 1 race, maybe 2. Phelps had to repeatedly put himself in position to perform at the highest level over and over again. Physically, that's demanding. Mentally, it's exhausting. Then came London, then Rio. Different versions of Michael Phelps, different stages of life, different expectations, yet somehow he remained relevant. That's what separates true legends from champions. Champions dominate a moment. Legends dominate generations. I admired the way he adapted. I admired the way he handled success. And perhaps most importantly, I admired the way he kept finding motivation after achieving things most athletes only dream about. Because motivation changes once you've already won everything. The hunger that gets you to the top isn't always the hunger that keeps you there. Phelps figured out how to survive both. That's incredibly rare. When people ask me why he's at the top of my list, the answer isn't simply the medals. It's because he forced all of us to reconsider what Olympic excellence could look like. He expanded the boundaries. He changed expectations. And for years, he carried the weight of being the standard that everyone else was measured against. Very few athletes ever experienced that. Even fewer handled it successfully. Michael Phelps did. And that's why when I think about athletes I've admired throughout my life, his name is the one that ultimately rises to the top. Looking back now, what stands out to me isn't the number of medals these athletes won. It's the qualities they represented. Jesse Owens showed what courage looks like when the stakes are bigger than sport itself. Edwin Moses showed the power of discipline and preparation. Sergey Bubka taught us that limits are often farther away than we think. Michael Johnson proved that you don't have to follow someone else's blueprint to become great. And Michael Phelps showed what happens when talent, discipline, and ambition all meet at exactly the right moment. What's interesting is that none of them made me want to be them. They made me want to be a better version of myself. I think that's the real difference between greatness and admiration. Greatness can impress you. Admiration changes you. When my career was over and the crowds disappeared, I found myself thinking less about race times and gold medals and more about the people who helped define an era. The athletes who raised the standard for everyone around them. The athletes who made excellence feel normal even when it wasn't. That's a rare gift. The Olympics has always been filled with extraordinary champions. Every 4 years, new names emerge and new records are written. But only a handful of athletes leave something behind that lasts long after the results are forgotten. These 5 did. And maybe that's what I've come to appreciate most with age. The medals matter. The records matter. History matters. But in the end, the athletes we remember most are often the ones who showed us something larger than victory. Those are the athletes I admired. Those are the athletes who helped shape the Olympic movement. And those are the athletes whose influence will still be felt long after all of us are gone.